Environment and Climate Change Canada has forecast a series of storms with more atmospheric rivers predicted to come to British Columbia over the coming week. These storms are coming at a time when we're already grappling with some of the most destructive weather we've ever seen. They are coming as crews work day and night to repair the extensive damage from last week. And while there is still significant flood damage in many places throughout the province, we are making progress on our recovery. But in many ways, we are still in uncharted territory when it comes to these storms. Having several destructive storms in a row is not anywhere near normal. We've had almost a dozen atmospheric rivers since mid-September. The ground is already saturated, which means that even a routine storm for this time of year can cause rivers and streams to rise faster and potentially flood. The ground is wetter, snowmelt is occurring, and some areas are extremely vulnerable due to recent wildfires and droughts. Although we are up to the challenge, we are working through a monumental task. Environment and Climate Change Canada modelers are working hard to try to predict where these storms will strike and how severe they will be. Crews are working around the clock to make critical repairs on Sumas Prairie before the next weather systems come. Through all of this, some people are returning to their homes in Merritt, Princeton, and elsewhere. They're beginning the difficult work of dealing with the debris and the destruction that floodwaters left behind. And yet others remain evacuated, some now for more than a week. In Princeton, Canadian Armed Forces are now on site, with more expected to arrive later today. Conditions are even more challenging for residents along Highway 8 between Merritt and Spence's Bridge. The pictures and videos showing large sections of the highway washed away by the Nicola River are dramatic. Residents along that corridor needed to evacuate quickly, often with just the clothes on their backs. The timeline for their return and return of this route is not yet known. However, in the meantime, the province will be here and will continue to provide the emergency supports that people need. These are complicated and dynamic times. Because of that, we've set up a new Service BC contact center line where you can get information on things related to floods like emergency supports, disaster financial aid, mental health supports, road conditions and travel, federal supports like employment insurance, agriculture supports. And more information will be added as we continue to move through our response to help British Columbians. The toll-free phone number is 1-833-376-2452. This resource is available from 7:30 a.m. in the morning to 5 p.m., 7 days a week. I know I share with all British Columbians a deep sadness for the loss of life, the destruction, and the upheaval. And yet, there is some good news. Although there is still a lot of work to be done, exceptional people are doing it. Thousands of emergency workers, including government, first responders, construction crews, volunteers, soldiers, and more, are working hard to help keep people safe and get communities the supports that they need. As announced yesterday, more help is on the way. The province is partnering with the Canadian Red Cross to provide $2,000 in supports for those who have been evacuated. Donations for flood relief are flowing into the Red Cross, the United Way, BC liquor stores, food banks, and other trusted organizations. Through monumental efforts, roads and railways are starting to reopen and move goods. Supply lines are stabilizing. And thanks to the majority of British Columbians who are adhering to gas rationing in their areas, shopping only for food in the short term, shortages are starting to ease in many areas. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to meet with First Nations leadership along with Minister Rankin. It was an opportunity to hear their concern and seek ways to better align our emergency responses. There are further challenges ahead, but we all have the same goal: to keep the people in this province as safe as we can. First Nations communities have stepped up countless times to care for displaced British Columbians in need. And this storm event is no different. Near Hope, The Squahaluk and Seabird Island First Nation took in stranded motorists after the Highway 7 mudslides, many of whom had been sleeping in their cars. The Lillooet Friendship Centre provided meals and a warm place to stay for dozens more following the Highway 99 slides. The Sequoialuks First Nation opened their gym to house stranded travelers. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all in the communities that have stepped up to help those in need. It's truly a remarkable side of British Columbians. Together, we will see the other side of these storms. But for now, we are still a long way from being out of danger. We must remain vigilant, especially as these weather systems come back again. We need to be prepared. Do what you can to storm-proof your properties. Be sure to regularly check for updates, warnings, and alerts from local and First Nation authorities. If you're in a flood-prone area, be prepared to evacuate when to ask to, and avoid any unnecessary travel. Stay off restricted roadways. Adhere to gas rationing rules. Buy only what you need in the short term. Keep emergency supplies in your vehicles, such as food, water, warm clothes, and a blanket, just in case. And know this, we are all in this together. We're all going to work hard to build back better, and we will be building back better, so that we can better withstand the extreme weather events that are part of the future. And through this, I know British Columbians will continue to rise to these challenges by being calm, compassionate, generous, kind, reasoned, and resilient. That's how we've got through the challenges of the last 20 months, whether it's been COVID, whether it's been fires, whether it's been floods. And we're going to continue doing it. With that, I'd now like to turn it over to Minister Rankin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Farnworth. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're here today in Lekwungen-speaking territory, the territory currently of the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. As we all know, I think Indigenous communities and First Nations have been heavily impacted by recent flooding and landslides. Many First Nations are now facing the impact of these events, including being displaced from their homes, concerns about food security and harvesting, difficulties practicing ceremony and culture, and being separated from family and loved ones. And the floods have only added to the trauma of the last year. Minister Farnworth talked about that. Wildfires, COVID-19, in addition the opioid crisis and the residential school findings, the heat dome, and of course the continuing impacts of climate change. In the last few days, I've been able to speak with many chiefs in the Mid-Island, in Lytton, and Agassiz, Merritt, and Hope, and other impacted nations in the interior. Chiefs and members of Indigenous communities have shown enormous resilience and great leadership during this difficult period. For example, the new fuel restrictions that Minister Farnworth talked about were implemented last week, and the chiefs of the Nachalnith and chair of the Tribal Council were instrumental in a response to work with my ministry to ensure that there was unrestricted access for essential vehicles in remote Indigenous communities. The work to ensure First Nations can access available supports is happening across the government. EMBC, with the help from CN Rail, organized delivery of over 3,000 pounds of food to several impacted First Nations. We're also helping move health authority personnel and medications to outlying areas so that we can continue to support families and individuals who need assistance. In partnership with the First Nations Emergency Services Society, the First Nation Health Authority, Indigenous Services Canada, our government has assembled multi-agency teams that will better support First Nation communities with little or no access. We're calling these Integrated Indigenous Response and Recovery Deployment Teams. Staff from the First Nations Emergency Services Society, the First Nation Health Authority, Indigenous Services Canada, and Emergency Management BC will all be part of these teams. Yesterday, I was on a call with First Nation leaders and Minister Farnworth. We heard from impacted communities. We heard their concerns as to how we could improve our response. and I heard we have more work to do. We must improve our communications with First Nation communities in advance of and during emergencies. We need to streamline our processes to help people access supports more easily. And we can work to ensure that the supports provided to First Nation communities are meeting the needs identified by the communities themselves. I've also heard many inspiring stories of First Nation peoples helping their neighboring communities. It's this spirit of cooperation that will see us through these very difficult times. And it's an incredibly stressful time for everyone. And I've heard from chiefs of impacted nations and members of the First Nations Leadership Council how people are being faced with the compounding impacts of multiple crises, as well as, in some cases, systemic racism within the emergency social services system. First Nations have suggested that we must work to increase understanding and training among emergency social services staff and volunteers, so we have the tools to identify racism and address incidents if and when they arise. During the 2021 wildfire event, EMBC hired an Indigenous ESS training specialist. This position is responsible for integrating culturally safe practices into emergency support services. EMBC's Emergency Support Services team has linked to the First Nation Health Authority and into reception centres in Kamloops and Abbotsford to provide cultural supports for evacuees. This includes offering space for culturally significant practices such as smudging that will be provided by 2 local knowledge keepers. These are just our first steps. This crisis and the events of the last year have shown how critical it is for all levels of government to work together in an emergency. And weather experts are saying that we'll see more rain in the coming week. In order to prepare First Nation communities, we are engaging with impacted nations. We're reaching out to determine current and future needs and readying the integrated Indigenous response and recovery deployment teams that I mentioned earlier. I want to end by thanking the First Nation leaders throughout British Columbia for their courage, their compassion, and their patience as we all work together to get through this crisis. I'd also like to thank the First Nation Emergency Services Society, the First Nation Health Authority, and Indigenous Services Canada for their leadership and work as well. Thank you. Minister Fleming.
Thank you, Minister Rankin, and good afternoon. I want to begin the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure's update today by talking about Highway 1 through the Fraser Valley. We're pleased to report that some critical temporary repairs are now completed and that water levels continue to recede. Today, our crews are on the flood-affected portion of Highway 1, clearing debris off the road. We're looking to have this road open at some point tomorrow. So Highway 1 tomorrow is what we are projecting as the estimated opening time through the Fraser Valley and to connect with the rest of Highway 1. We know that people in this region need to travel around. This will provide significant relief, and we will keep people updated on that estimated time of opening. While we get traffic moving again on Highway 1, I do want to talk about the travel restriction orders that came into effect at 8 p.m. last night on Highway 7 from the area west of Agassiz to Mission. This had to take place. This was necessary because the trucks and supply chains we sought to reactivate were hopelessly congested on Highway 7, and this was not a decision that was taken lightly, but we needed to unblock that corridor so that goods could begin to move and reactivate supply chains that all British Columbians depend on. I am pleased to say that the restrictions are working. As of this morning, essential traffic was able to move significantly faster than at the same time yesterday. Travel is still taking longer than usual, but these short-term restrictions are helping us get essential goods and services moving out of the Lower Mainland to communities around BC. I understand that these restrictions are very challenging for some people, and I want to thank everybody who lives in that area for doing their part. So although we have some potential good news for Highway 1 tomorrow, Highway 7 for the time being will continue to have restrictions with a focus on essential vehicle travel. And until we have a full understanding of how Highway 1 will operate, and as we monitor upcoming weather events, we will continue to have those restrictions in place on the number 7. Last week, the federal government worked with the United States to implement measures to help fast-track truckers who don't typically travel to the U.S., and the United States responded, and they temporarily relaxed some of its permitting requirements so that those truckers could drive into the Washington state and re-enter Canada beyond the flood impact area. And I'm pleased to say that the United States has added more exemptions to that list as of today. This allows even more essential goods and products to move on alternate routes through the U.S., through highways in northern Washington to reconnect to the rest of our province. So there's more positive news for our supply chains as well. Last night, CP Rail restarted its operations. As of today, CN Rail is expecting to have its trains operational by tomorrow. That is going to be a huge help for British Columbia and all Canadians. And I want to express my sincere thanks to my federal counterpart, Minister Omar Alghabra, for his continued support for British Columbia. I also want to talk about working with Indigenous communities through our ministry. Constructive partnerships are what we've talked about in this time of crisis over the last number of updates, recovering transportation corridors, recovering trade routes. I've talked about our partnership with the federal government, with private sector companies, but there's also been a huge impact on Indigenous communities where we've had highway closures. And my ministry is working very closely with the Forest Ministry to make sure that there's temporary access restored for Indigenous communities that have had road access cut off after the flood event. And we continue to work in collaboration with Indigenous communities on the repair work that is needed. We've set up regular calls in my ministry with Indigenous leadership to provide real-time updates on each site as we repair and work toward reopening our highways. We've hired Indigenous companies to deliver on archaeological services, for example, on Highway 1 through the Fraser Canyon. We'll continue to look for these consulting services from communities as we repair our infrastructure. Some of the Indigenous communities that were not directly impacted by the floods have also reached out to our ministry as well, and we are and they reached out to offer their equipment and resources to help in the province-wide response, and we thank those Indigenous communities and companies for that support. We appreciate the spirit of collaboration and partnership with Indigenous communities, and we look forward to continuing to work together in these extraordinary times. I do want to share a couple of stories that emerged now that we have updated on some of the highway reopenings. And they are inspirational ones. As everyone knows, last Monday evening, when the storms had damaged so much infrastructure, there were several hundred truck drivers essentially trapped throughout the southern interior part of the province, and the response was unbelievable. The thought that communities had for truck drivers who were far from home and facing uncertainty ahead of them. The generosity, the caring that Hope residents showed is of course a thing of legend now. But this was taking place in other communities as well. In Golden, the local Gurdwara Sabib broadcast an invitation to truck drivers in the area to access shelter and to have food delivered to them. In Kamloops, the local Sikh community was serving up to 200 meals a day to stranded truckers. These are the things, the moments where British Columbians came together, fed one another, cared for one another, and sheltered one another. In our own ministry, we have a bit of a hero that I want to give a shout out to today, who helped people who were trapped on Highway 7, Tracy Winnick. She displayed incredible leadership in a very difficult situation. She knew what to do. She walked the line of cars, talked to drivers. She shared her food and water because she was prepared for any circumstance. And she was helping to update stranded travelers with information that she could garner. She communicated with the maintenance contractor, with emergency responders. She helped keep people safe and calm. And she insisted that she be the last person who was flown out and evacuated from that stretch of highway. So we have people like Tracy to thank in situations that happened across the province. Let me just say in closing, a word of thanks to all those who've gotten us to where we are today, to be able to update and reopen infrastructure, the responders who showed up, the people who welcomed and cared for people who were stranded in not their own community, the crews who put in incredibly long hours repairing our roads and continue to do so. We have essential goods and services moving in the province today, and it's because thousands of British Columbians with skills and ability and their first instinct being to help stepped up and did exactly that. Thank you. And I'll now ask Minister Popham to come.
Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here today to give an update from the agriculture sector in BC. Yesterday, I went out with MLA Pam Alexis and MLA Ian Payton for a flyover the valley. We were able to fly over Abbotsford and up into Chilliwack. We had hoped to get up into the Merritt area, but the weather was not our friend yesterday, so we'll be going there in the coming days. We also were able to get onto the ground and have a meeting with I'll wait for that to finish. With Mayor Braun of Abbotsford, who I just have to say, I just can't thank him for his tireless work. He's had no sleep. A really amazing community leader. We were able to meet with him. We looked at maps of the restoration of some of the minor roadways that are going through that area and how they're coming back online. The conversations that we were able to have at one cross checkpoint with farmers was really, really important. We had about 30 farmers join us on Highway 1 off to the side. And I have to tell you that there was a lot of shared tears and a lot of hugs. These folks are going through a lot, and they made time out of their really incredibly busy, disrupted lives to come and tell us face to face the stories that they have. And so we know that it's definitely our livestock sector that's been affected, but many blueberry farmers, vegetable farmers also came out, greenhouse sector came out to tell us many of them are displaced out of their own homes, and it's very tough times. But there's, within those very difficult stories, there's also some pretty amazing stories that are continuing to emerge. Holger Schwitzenberg, the chair of the BC Dairy Association, was able to tell us about a dairy farm in the valley. Dairy farmers Carl and Rudy Meyer, who have a dairy with 180 dairy cows. The waters came up so fast on Monday, they couldn't get their livestock out. And so all 180 dairy cows were up to their necks in water. And those brothers went in and fed those cows hay for 2 days while those cows were submerged in that water. And I have to say that on Wednesday, the waters receded. The cows are fine and they're back online and they're milking those cows. So that, huge kudos to Carl and Rudy. Thank you for being amazing local heroes. That was an amazing story to hear. The conversations continue with the federal government. We are developing an agri-recovery program right now to support our producers. The details of that will be coming out in the coming days. Where these conversations that we're having on the ground are really important, so we capture all of the needs that are out there in the agriculture community. Farmers are really concerned right now about the removal of deceased animals. We do have a location in Abbotsford where people are taking calls. There's a number of people where people can call to have animals removed. We know that there's a lot of grief that farmers are feeling around this issue. I went and spoke with the folks that are taking those phone calls, and their job is tough too. So I want to thank them. They're receiving calls from, it's just the issue is very sad. And so, but farmers just know that there's people on the other end of those phones that understand how difficult this is for you, and they're trying to get this process moving as fast as possible. We're working with local governments on where to take those deceased animals right now. And so we are seeing movement there, but the best thing you can do, especially if you're in the poultry industry, hog industry, dairy industry, get a hold of your associations. There's a very close working relationship that they have with our ministry right now. We've made about 1,200 connections directly since last Monday, and a lot of that also includes outreach to Indigenous communities. We've had conversations with, we have a Ministers Indigenous Advisory Council on Agriculture and Food, and so roundtable with them yesterday, the First Nations Agricultural Association of BC, Seabird Island First Nation, Lac-Skiltsap Village Government, Kanakabar First Nation, Coldwater Indian Band, Lower Nicola First Nation, and Lytton First Nation. And we're going to be continuing to reach out with these important partners and talk to them about their experiences and perspectives as we look to making our food system as resilient and sustainable as we can. Our food supply chain continues to be stable, so I want to reassure British Columbians that there are truckloads of food that continue to pour into British Columbia, and those shelves are being stocked. We believe that at this point we're back operating at about 80% of normal with milk deliveries. And so I know there's been a bit of a conversation out there about some smaller places not having milk on the shelves, but that's being resolved. And so I want to say just in closing that there's good news stories that are emerging, and we see a lot of these local heroes showing up, but that really doesn't override the grief that we know the communities are feeling. But I think what it does is it allows us to feel hopeful for better days. Thank you.